Lord of the Oasis. Chapter 261, The Awaked Bunduk. Yes, I allow it. Kant nodded, even though he didn't quite understand it. Thank you for your authorization, my lord. The mages lowered their heads to express their gratitude. As they spoke softly, they chanted the magic incantation of the Unfoth Empire. Within the gemstones inlaid with silver and precious materials, a faint wave of ripples appeared and gradually lit up. The king's sword in Kant's hand let out an intimidating cry. A faint golden light streaked across the gilded pattern. An epiphany appeared in Kant's mind. The incantation and staff from the mages beside him released a wave of mind power that wrapped around the king's sword. It was like the sword was welcoming the enchanting as well. The spell invited the elven divine power contained in the sword to heal the Bunduk, who was lying on the bed in front of him. His face was pale and was heavily injured. In Kant's heart, if he wanted to, he could cut off this connection at any time. Moreover, he could borrow the elven divine power on the king's sword to intimidate the mind power that came to communicate with him. He could even cut it off directly. This was equivalent to a psychic attack, or it could be called a soul attack. Thus, the mages would carefully ask Kant for permission to come into contact with these elven divine powers first. This was because Kant had to be focused and cleared his mind. Otherwise, if the king's sword sensed something wrong, it would instantly explode with terrifying power. As mages who used their spiritual power to directly come into contact with the elven divine power, they would probably be destroyed by this power on the spot. They might even find their souls directly along the spiritual power. The consequences would be terrible. If they were lucky, their spiritual power would be weakened and become an ordinary person. If they were unlucky, they might even become an idiot with only 3 years old intelligence. Thinking of this, the mages became even more cautious. The spiritual power of the elves had already been drawn out. It carried with it the glorious might of a sovereign king. Golden light flickered on the gold-plated scabbard and hilt. Even on the body of the sword scabbard, the gold-plated part was also releasing a gentle and inviolable power. The grace of the emperor was like the sea, and the might of the emperor was like the abyss. As the emperor, the grace could nourish all things, and the anger could also burn the world. However, what was displayed now was the grace from Kant. Under the guidance of the mages, this gentle elven divine power slowly came into contact with Bunduk's bandaged abdomen. Ignoring the physical barrier, the golden light slowly descended. Zi zi zi. A slight sound, like a ladle of oil meets cold water. Curling black smoke instantly spread out in the golden light. Bunduk's already pale face suddenly appeared a few abnormal red. He was still in a daze and let out a few unconscious moans, as if he was in great pain. His face was full with cold sweat, suddenly wet the surrounding pillows and sheets. The energy is neutralized. The mages opened their mouths and explained in a grave tone, it's a normal phenomenon. All right, Kant nodded. The golden light finally entered Bunduk's chest and abdomen. The sizzling sound that was originally like frying meat disappeared, and even the black smoke became fainter and fainter. Bunduk's face regained its calmness. However, his face was still pale. In a short moment, the cold sweat on his head had soaked through the surface of the bed sheets and pillows. Clearly, when the positive and negative energy was neutralized, the conflict between the two powers was still intense. Treatment is over. The mages let out a sigh of relief. The mages withdrew their spiritual power, and the king's sword in Kant's hand also ended with a light hum. The golden light on the gilded pattern also disappeared. Regarding this, the mages turned their heads and said to James, Lord James, the corrosive nature of the negative energy has already been suppressed and neutralized by the gentle positive energy. Next, it is up to your medical skills to complete it. You can save Lord Bunduk's life through surgery and follow-up recuperation, allowing him to completely recover. Thank you very much, James nodded his head sincerely. Well done. Kant also praised them. These mages from the Unfoth Empire were indeed much stronger than when they were mage apprentices. Whether it was their performance in the battle or their use of magic knowledge in daily life, they were beyond compared to their apprentices' selves. No matter how good the apprentices were, they still could not compare to the mages who were in combat status every day. Do your best. The mages lowered their heads and responded humbly. At this moment, Bunduk, who was still lying on the bed, opened his eyes slightly. His pale face turned a little red as he said weakly, "Water." Bunduk is awake. James was pleasantly surprised. As expected of magic, it's remarkably effective. He quickly picked up the wooden bowl of warm water beside him. He walked over and handed it to Bunduk. "Mr. Bunduk, the water is here. Drink it quickly. However, don't drink too much water because you lose too much blood. I will arrange the most appropriate recuperation later so that you can recover quickly and return to your previous health." "Oh, it's Mr. James." Bunduk blinked and glanced weakly at Kant and the mages beside him. Suddenly, his dizzy head regained its clarity. He struggled to sit up. "I'm sorry, Lord Kant. I seem to have been injured and did not complete the mission you gave me." "Don't be too polite." Kant saw that he had regained consciousness and smiled. "Rest well. Your mission has been completed. That abyssal demon has been completely killed." He paused and then comforted Bunduk. "This village still needs you to protect it. Get well as soon as possible. Your mission is still very important." I will get well as soon as possible." Bunduk nodded solemnly. "All right, James. You will treat Bunduk. If there is no emergency situation in this room, do not let outsiders in. Otherwise, the infection will cause his illness to worsen." The matter was basically settled, and Kant also advised considerately, "James, in the next few months, the village will have to rely on you to maintain it. Please be careful. If anything happens, I will arrange for Firentus or Rolf to come and help." "Understood," James nodded. However, there was a hint of awkwardness on his face. "If it's Rolf, I don't think there's a need. Things in the village aren't busy at the moment, I can handle it by myself." His tone was a little hesitant. "I think Mr. Bunduk doesn't want to see Rolf when he's recuperating." "That's right. I feel like I'm recovering very quickly," Bunduk also declined. "If Rolf comes over, it won't be enough to cause trouble for us. Then I'll respect your opinion." Kant shrugged. The relationship between the two NPC factions was quite complicated. However, they basically never communicated with each other. Even in the tavern, it was considered a good relationship if they were indifferent to each other. If they were on bad terms, they would draw their swords and look for trouble after they drank too much. However, they did not need to help each other. It was good that they could help each other. Rolf's task at the posthouse was equally difficult. More and more fine white salt from the Oasis lookout appeared at the stone pass. After earning a large amount of silver coins, it also attracted more and more greedy gazes. Those noble families would not let go of this huge sum of money easily. Baron Dillon was indeed at the front. But those greedy nobles would not be intimidated by a small baron like him. It was probably while Kant was talking here, there might be many evil-minded trade caravan appeared at the post house. Who knew how many spies wanted to escape Rolf and the desert bandits' patrol and go to the Oasis lookout, but they were cut off by the desert bandits who were patrolling everywhere at all times with machetes and thrown into the desert as warning signs. They were told what would happen if they did not follow the rules. Kant would not be merciful to those who were spying on his own estate. Rolfs had very high authority in the post house. He was even allowed to lead his troops to attack when he was faced with a possible enemy and did not need to report. Kant walked out of Bunduk's recuperation room. He still had many things to deal with. For example, the current Aran village had reached the level up stage. However, just before the level up, Kant still needed to plan the current terrain. After all, the Sceneway range was located in a mountainous area, and the usable land was extremely small. It couldn't be compared to the flat land of the Naran desert. At the very least, the Naran Desert could be built at will without considering the terrain. But the Sinway Range was another case. Although there were about 1,600 acres of flat land on the mountain peak, it couldn't be built arbitrarily. Kant wanted not only villages, but also towns and cities. What he wanted was a production base with agriculture, animal husbandry, breeding, and handicraft as its core, which could supply at least 2 city-level production bases for nearly 30,000 people, and a crucial backline for the entire force. All the buildings that he had won in the lottery would be built here. A mere 1,600 arcs of flat land on top of the mountain would not be able to meet his future arrangements. Therefore, the planning had to be even more careful. Especially in the deeper parts of the Sinway Range, which was close to the size of a primitive forest, a good plan in advance would definitely allow a city that was well built in the future to step into a glorious development. Kant already had some plans in his mind. He came to the outside of the council hall. He looked at the flat area behind the council hall. With a thought, the 50 traditional Rhodic houses immediately appeared. The data flow was spreading. The houses made of wood were clearly layered, thick, and beautiful. They were indeed the traditional houses of the Rhodic people. The wooden houses built on the mountain had good resistance to damps, earthquakes, and floods. After all, the Rhodic mountain area was not comparable to the Swadian plain. Even if there was a large amount of stone, in order to prevent earthquakes, floods, and other disasters, wooden buildings were used. This was the wisdom of the Rhodic people. At the same time, the 400 refugees from Kingdom of Rhodoks were selected by Kant. As the golden light dispersed, groups of refugees came with groups at the foot of the mountain. They were full of joy as they looked at the river and hydraulic mill at the foot of the mountain, as well as the city wall and sentry tower at the top of the mountain. Their eyes were filled with respect for the future. The Ravenstern Rangers came down to arrange for them. The 100 Rhodic peasants were still busy gathered to welcome the arrival of their new companions. They opened the gate and helped them carry their luggage, kept asking about their well-being. The Rhodic people could be said to be the most united. After all, being able to establish a country independently and resist the oppression of the Kingdom of Swadia was a symbol of unity. And the backbone of the Kingdom of Rhodoks, the Rhodoks phalanx formation, required their compatriots to stand shoulder to shoulder and believe in their comrades by their side. Only by uniting together would they be able to bring out their greatest power. Only by believing in their compatriots could they win the future. The Rhodic people firmly believed in this. Chapter 262, The Construction of Aran Village. With the help of the peasant who came first, the new refugees from Kingdom of Rhodoks began to take off their dirty clothes and bathe in the nearby river. The bathing time of men and women was separated. It was not only to prevent disease, but also to welcome the ceremony of a new life. Wash away the old dust and welcome a new life. The customs of the Rhodic people originated from the Swadian people, and they also believed in this. And at the top of the mountain, new buildings began to appear from the void. 50 traditional Rhodic wooden houses were neatly arranged, and they were quickly built after the council hall. The stone foundation, the main body made of high-quality wood, including the thick wooden boards that acted as walls and the roof, were all very well made. Just like how a high-quality architect planned, it was completed by the combined efforts of excellent carpenters and construction workers. Including the thick wooden floors that were close to half a meter above the ground, it was not only moisture-proof but also able to prevent waterlogging. Even if there was a mountain flood or other disaster, the flood could flow along the floor that was supported by pillars to the low-lying area to avoid disaster. Basically, all the buildings were like this. The council hall was also built in the same way. This was the role of the steps. It was very suitable for the current mountain environment of the Sinway Range. It could be said to be very practical. The following buildings were much more ordinary. 5 wool workshops and 5 tanning workshops were built side by side on the left. This was the handicrafts area planned to be developed on the mountain top in the future. It was responsible for weaving wool into blankets or wool fabrics and making use of the rich wildlife resources. Tanning leather or soft fur became the center of the handicraft industry. On the right side were chicken farms and beekeeping farms. The cuckoo grouse and buzzing bees almost treated this mountain area as a paradise. This was indeed the case. Wild animals that could threaten the residents and livestock were all hunted cleanly. The Ravenstern Rangers did not care about killing animals. In the icy world of the Kingdom of Ravenstern, they relied on the prey in the Misty Mountain for a living. Almost all rangers were top-notch hunters, and they were extremely experienced in hunting. This also caused the carnivorous wild animals in the nearby mountains to become dried meat hanging in the storeroom. Even the number of pheasants and hares had decreased by quite a bit. Burning mountains to create farmland was more or less the same situation. At the southernmost location, the originally lush forest had long been cut down. Black smoke was rising from the mud kill, and a large number of charcoal was burned out to directly supply Trondheim Castle. The salt workshop and sugar workshop at Trondheim Castle consumed a large amount of charcoal. But it was not necessarily the case. The trees around the village and a lot of well-structured and smooth wood were transported to the weapons workshop of Trondheim Castle. Although they didn't have iron ore and couldn't make many excellent weapons, the arrow shafts that were commonly needed could be made with a large amount of feathers that they had obtained from hunting. In addition, the iron ingots that were purchased from the merchants and the arrowheads that were hammered in the blacksmith's shop could be made into hundreds of ordinary arrows or crossbows every day. Although the quantity was small, it could still maintain the current consumption and save up a lot. The Viegers archers and the Ravenstern Rangers were the main force of the arrow consumption. Especially in wartime. It was common to consume tens of thousands of arrows every day. Just like last time, when Trondheim was still a fortress, the expedition army of the Kingdom of Greymane was desperate to attack the city. In less than 2 hours, they had consumed close to tens of thousands of arrows. If it were not for Kant's 3 ammunition recovery spells, the city wall's defense line would have been broken through long ago. At that time, he did not have as many archers as he had now. Although the Swadian militia had hunting crossbow, they were very weak. Even so, the number of arrows used up was very shocking. With the current 500 archers as an example, it was estimated that the tens of thousands of arrows used in the battle at that time would be emptied in 10 minutes this time. This group of archers had been strengthened by the system. When the arm was pulled, it would often cause severe strain on the muscles. However, as a troop class of the system, they had sufficient endurance. Hence, the rain of arrows was extremely high in density and frequency. Kant had originally considered negotiating with Baron Dillon at the Stone Pass to import some arrows and crossbow arrows for storage. However, they were naturally rejected because they were asking for military supplies. Now that there was a village in the Seenway range, the problem of producing arrows and crossbows had been solved. Although they were not as good as all arrows or steel crossbows. However, with the abilities of these top-level archers, they were able to kill any armored unit. Even if they encountered a top-level heavy armored unit, they still had advantage by relying on the city walls. After all, they could shoot from a high vantage point. At close range, the power was enough to injure the enemy in heavy armor. Following Kant's plan, more buildings began to appear, including the Craftsmen's Guild. They were of the same type as the Oasis lookout. It was a castle-level building, but it can be built at village level now. With this building, a large number of civilians could be trained into talents in various industries. Currently, there was also a sheep farm. However, Kant did not want to build it on the top of the mountain. Compared to a chicken farm and a beekeeping farm, a single sheep farm occupied an area of 50 acres. Kant could currently build 5 sheep farms. After all, raising medium-sized livestock required a little activity environment. However, the sheep could not be raised free-range, because sheep needed to be kept in captive, similar to a camel farm, but the requirements were even higher. After all, this was a breed that produced wool. Every month, the wool had to be shaved to obtain wool, and there were strict rules in raising it. If they were raised free range, they would easily encounter danger. For example, the grouse would flutter their wings in groups and return to the cliff or forest. If they encountered wild beasts, they could even fly to the trees to hide. If these sheep encountered wild beasts, they would probably become delicious fresh mutton. Build it in the area near the road at the bottom of the mountain. Kant made a decision in his heart. As he communicated with the system in his mind, he once again entered God's view. The sheep farm was built at the bottom of the mountain. On the left side of the road, although it was also a slope, with the appearance of the system's rules, the entire slope suddenly turned into a slightly flat area. Although it was still a slope, there was at least no problem in raising sheep. The small river that originated from the subterranean river flowed on the right side of the road, and it was quite convenient to draw water. The 500 sheep that came from the sheep farm bleated and appeared in the sheep pen. The surrounding area was surrounded by a half-meter-high wooden fence, which acted as a barrier, separating the weeds and shrubs on the surrounding slope. After hunting, the surrounding wild beasts became scarce. This small hill that was close to the top of the village was also an area that Kant intended to develop. The slope of this hill was relatively gentle. The lush vegetation on it was all shrubs, but there were fewer trees. It was a good place to build terraced fields. Through Kant's God's view observation, this hill could cultivate thousands of acres of terraced fields, so there was absolutely no problem. Moreover, the road had to be taken step by step, and the terraced fields had to be opened up by mountain slopes. As long as the weeds, shrubs, and the woods were cleaned, the development of terraced fields were basically feasible. Moreover, he still had buildings. 100 arcs of wheat terraced fields, 100 arcs of chickpea fields, and 50 arcs of scattered flower fields. These could all be planted directly. With his thoughts, just above the sheep farm, the originally barren land began to change. Rows of land began to appear, eventually forming arcs of good farmland. The land was even quite fertile, even more fertile than the soil on the original mountain, just like a completely reclaimed plain field. 250 acres of terraced fields were formed. Next was a stone canal made of stones. It was the same building Kant had obtained in the lottery. The canal made of stones was able to supply all the terraced fields. As for the source of the irrigation, he had already considered it. Spring's eye. As far as Kant's eyes could see, it was a water flow that appeared in a depression at the top of the hill. The spring was a water source that the system directly connected to the water elemental world. A large amount of fresh water gushed out of the void spring and gathered at the top of the stone canal. The fresh water directly entered the canal, irrigated all the terraced fields, and finally flowed into a small river. But Kant was not the only one who had this special gift pack. The reward from the 2 lucky draws could be said to be bountiful. This was because Kant's special gift pack also had river channel, tributary, stream, and lake. And there was also a reward that could be obtained by exploring the depths of the desert, Spring's Eye. So Kant was not stingy when using it. His mind moved slightly. The effect of river channel was activated instantly. In Kant's God's view, a river channel construction plan appeared in his vision. He subconsciously began to spread from the river he chose at the foot of the mountain all the way to the mountain pass. There were 5 temporary camps set up by the desert bandits there, and all of them were covered. However, this river channel was not a natural depression and underground, but a real, artificial river channel that was 5 meters wide and 3 meters deep. There was a stone-paved road next to it, and there were stone slabs at the bottom of the river channel that could be used to remove silt. The river channel had been widened. The stone road and the river accompanied each other, and they reached the mountain pass from the foot of the mountain. The overall appearance of the river looked like an ancient passage. However, compared to the subterranean river, which was at least 4 to 5 meters deep and 30 meters wide, this river was still very small. Because of the area of the river, the surface of the water instantly dropped to more than 10 centimeters. Instead, it flowed like a small stream. At most, it could pass through a person's calves. It looked quite pitiful. However, Kant's mind immediately chose the tributary. This was a special topographical transformation. The tributary could directly communicate with the surrounding water veins. It could connect both sides. Kant naturally chose the subterranean river at the bottom of the mountain. With the appearance of the tributary, the cracks on the wall suddenly expanded into a 4 to 5 meters cave. Large amounts of underground water surged out and filled the river. The level of the water that was originally falling rapidly increased until it was slightly lower than the dam before it finally calmed down. The small river flowed slowly. It was neither too fast nor too slow. 5 meters wide was enough for ships to travel. The bulk of the goods really did not need to pass through the stone pavement on the side. They could be directly transported to the mountain pass by small merchant ships. Kant's wild desire to use the river to connect Arran and Trondheim had never disappeared. Chapter 263, Leveled Up Town. For example, the following river was the embodiment of Kant's ambition. Terrain transformation. River contains the mysterious power of rule. It can communicate with the water elemental plane and transform the terrain at the level of rule. It can connect existing lakes, subterranean rivers, subterranean lakes, river channels, ancient river channels, and dried river channels. The water elemental plane can provide water to form a river. Kant's breathing stopped slightly, and his face was filled with shock. He hadn't expected that this seemingly ordinary lottery result, this seemingly ordinary special gift pack, would actually contain such a terrifying result. It could be said to be able to change the current situation. That's right, it could change Kant's current layout in the Naran Desert. He looked at the system's description. It was able to directly connect existing lakes, subterranean rivers, subterranean lakes, rivers, ancient rivers, and dried-up rivers through the water elemental plane to form rivers. This was why Kant was shocked, the shock that a miracle appeared before his eyes. His idea could now become a reality. Connecting the Oasis lookout and the Sceneway range with rivers was no longer a dream. Transport ships could directly use the waterway to travel between the two places. The speed was fast, and the amount of goods transported was huge. It was completely different from the overland route. It beyond compared to just relying on camels or pack horses. The ship's goods would quickly travel between the two places. The elite troops could also use the waterway to travel between any area. However, Kant frowned slightly. After the shock just now, he suddenly found that he should keep calm. Something's wrong. Kant muttered to himself. His mind calmed down and he quickly regained his consciousness. Now that he was thinking seriously, if he really chose to use this special gift pack, it would be equivalent to being stupid. Because the current Kant did not have enough strength to protect this waterway. Strategically, he is still on the defensive. Whether it is the dukedom of Leo, or the distant coast of Mannheim. It was a threat to Kant. He could build Trondheim Castle here, and ensure his hegemony in the Naran Desert. The water resources of this castle, as well as the strong walls and towers were the guarantee of his power. This was his foundation. If this river appeared, his two estates could certainly communicate. But more enemies could use the water resources formed by this river to besiege Trondheim Castle for a long time, and even find Arran along the river, his weak rear. The gains didn't make up for the losses. It was completely inconsistent with the current situation. Kant needed the harsh environment of the Naran Desert as a natural moat. Instead of foolishly turning this harsh environment and the area that was extremely short of water into an area where the enemy could boldly launch a military and gave them beneficial help on logistics and supplies. After calming down, Kant could not help but smile bitterly. I'm possessed. He was now completely calm. Looking at this special gift pack river, he shook his head because of his impulsive thought just now. If he wanted to use it, he needed more development. At the very least, he needed to have the strength to defeat the enemy troops in the Naran Desert. Otherwise, this river would become the enemy's shortcut and backing, and not Kant's help. However, Kant could not use this river, but he could use lake. materialize immediately. In the thought communication system, a large amount of data flow instantly appeared. On the eastern side of the mountain peak, the terrain that was originally a cliff began to change along with the data flow. The area that was originally a complex low-lying area in a mountain valley began to expand in a short period of time. At the same time, it sank. When the data flow was small, it finally formed into a lake. It was more than 300 meters long and more than 200 meters wide, and its depth seemed to be about 4 meters. Next to it was a cave where water gushed out from underground. The water from the river flowed into the lake continuously, but at the same time, the water from both of them also flowed into the river channel, speeding up the flow of the river channel outside the Scenery range. Build the city wall. Kant materialized the building that he won in the last lottery. The 5 meters high and 2 meters wide stone city wall immediately appeared, but the direction of the construction was not at the top of the mountain, but around the mountain, completely separating the mountain from the Scenery range in the outside world. In this way, those wild beasts or demonized creatures would be completely locked in the outside world. The city wall was the isolation circle. Even the enemy could not climb over this city wall. After all, it was built according to the terrain of the mountain. Although it was at the foot of the mountain, coupled with the other low-lying areas and the intersection of the two mountains, the difference of the elevation between the wall and low-lying areas could reach more than 3 meters, which meant that the height of the city wall was increased. Especially the city gate. The only city gate that Kant had reserved was the one under the gentle slope in the south. As long as there was an enemy invasion, the busy peasants in the agricultural area and the livestock in the livestock area could quickly use this city gate to move in and defend this mountain. If they could not defend the city wall, they could also use the caves inside the city wall to escape into the relics of the temple, or they could go to the underground city of the karst cave where the ancient passage was located. Kant's current plan could be said to be extremely safe and secure. After all, with the development of Aaron, he would eventually be exposed to the world, and the pressure he would face would definitely increase dramatically. This was because Aaron was very close to the Stone Pass, much closer than Trondheim. Some enemies who harbored malicious intentions or were frustrated in the Oasis lookout would definitely come over to investigate, or even launch an attack to vent their hatred, as long as they knew that Kant's hidden forces were still here. Therefore, safety was the most important thing. However, to be able to break through a city or castle guarded by the Rodic people was a bit of a joke. Kant also had confidence in these Rodic people. Rodic's broad shield, the siege crossbow of the Rodic sergeant, and the deadly heavy bow of the Ravenstern ranger. If they wanted to break through this city wall, they had to at least leave behind several times of the corpses than the wall defenders. Moreover, Kant was going to level up Aaron village. His thoughts moved slightly. On his vision, a dialog box immediately popped up. Ding system prompt. Currently, the equipment of Aaron village is complete. Level up is allowed. Yes/no level up. The system gave him a choice. But Kant did not hesitate at this time. He said with certainty, level up. He was extremely certain. Aaron had been a village for too long. He needed more villages to level up to a higher level of the territory's central hub, to ensure that his development in the future would become more stable and faster. With his affirmation, the data stream instantly exploded. The council hall was wrapped in data. Large amounts of data streams began to entangle, bringing mysterious and bizarre rules to this world. As if he had broken some crystal wall and connected the rules of the two worlds, the council hall in front of Kant began to change. This was the most direct change after the rules merged. At the same time, the system continued to pop up the dialog box on his retina. Ding system prompt. The village has reached the level up standard. There are 2 modes for this level up. 1 fortress, military, /2 town, economy. Please make a reasonable choice based on the current situation. Once confirmed, there will be no changes afterward. Kant muttered to himself. After scanning through this option, a smile appeared on his face. Town. This was a completely different choice from when he chose Trondheim as the fortress. It also represented a completely different development. Ding system prompt. The mode confirmed as town. Level up of village. The data stream continued to spread. It seemed to last for a long time, but it only lasted for a few seconds. The data stream that completely covered the council hall was ferocious when it came, but it disappeared in the blink of an eye. Kant had also exited God's view. He stood next to the council hall again and turned his head to look. The council hall, which was originally just an ordinary two-story wooden house, was still 2 stories tall, but the area it occupied was several times larger. Even the rooms had changed from 6 to a total of 24. At the same time, there was a complete Lord's Hall, as well as offices on both sides, a living room, a kitchen, and a storeroom. The bedroom on the second floor and the additional storeroom were wrapped up. There were also many decorations that were in Roduk's style. For example, the wall decorations made from the head of a wild beast. There were also many artifacts carved from trees, inlaid with silver and gemstones. They looked very exquisite, including the animal skin on the floor. Only now did Kant think that the term council hall was very appropriate. Council hall in a fortress or castle was more like a military tower or small fortress. It was built to defend against the enemy. As for governing, there were not many designs. The current council hall was very suitable. The office next to it could accommodate government employees and maintain the commercial, handicraft, and agricultural arrangements of the town, as well as the most important tax revenue in the town. Starting from the town, Kant needed to recruit government employees to help the generals with office work. Especially after the town grew larger and more advanced, the number of government employees would increase. After all, with only 1 or 2 generals, it was difficult to maintain the operation of a huge city. He needed many subordinates to help him. Of course, Kant did not need to think too much for the time being. The town that had just appeared had not been built yet. All the buildings that belonged to the town still needed to be added. Open the town interface, Kant gave the order. Aaron. Lord, Kant. Balance, 135,630 dinar. Reputation, 32,800. Honor, 0. General, James, Bunduk. Type, Roduk Town. Current population, 500. Current troops, 517. Building, Council Hall, Town Level, House, 70, Fence, Mill, Watchtower, 4, Well, Ranger Camp, Stone City Wall, Chicken Farm, 5, Bee Farm, 5, Sheep Farm, 5, Wool Workshop, 5, Tanning Workshop, 5. Constructions available: house, grocery store, wheat field, pumpkin field, flax field, hunter's hut, blacksmith shop, barracks, stone walls, stone gates, arrow towers, weapons workshop, jail. Agricultural resources: wheat field, 100 arcs, chickpea field, 100 arcs, scattered flower field, 50 arcs. Animal husbandry: sand grouse, 500, bees, 50 beehives, sheep, 1000. Fighting force summary: 200 footmen, 217 archers. Current troops: Roduk Sergeant, 100, Roduk Trained Spearman, 100, Ravenstern Ranger, 87, Ravenstern Warden, 20, Roduk Crossbowman, 20. Roduk Trained Crossbowman, 100. Recruitable: Roduk People, Council Hall, Ravenstern Rangers, Ranger Camp. Comment: the brand new Aran town has just been established, and it seems to be in good condition. There were hundreds of acres of fields on the hillside, and sheep were moving leisurely in the fence. The residents were busy in the fields with hope, and the troops were patrolling the city walls, preparing to welcome the future in high spirits. Remark: non-system items are not included in the statistics. Chapter 264, the ever-changing mountains. The system interface was clearly marked. Kant muttered to himself. The town level was indeed different from the fortress-level buildings. Most of the buildings were ordinary civilian buildings. As for military buildings, there were very few of them. Other than the city walls, there were also the city gates. Even if there were buildings to defend against the enemy, they were just arrow towers. Compared to the fortress-level buildings with all sorts of military facilities, it was undoubtedly less safe. However, the town was primarily for the people. Kant had already expected this. As long as the council hall could recruit basic troop-class soldiers and the ranger camp could recruit strong level 4 archers, then the town would have enough self-protection ability. After all, if one wanted to take down a town with city walls and defensive troops, it would be quite difficult if they did not have larger troops than the defending troops. Moreover, this was a mountainous area with a complicated environment. With the city walls and towns built by relying on the terrain of the mountains, with the current defensive force, the town would not have a problem to defend against 3,000 enemy troops with siege weapons. Although Kant had paved roads that opened up the complicated Sinway range. However, outside the mountain pass was the Naran desert. The cruel environment also weakened any enemy supply lines. Even if there were paved roads as a path to enter the mountain pass, the steep terrain also increased the difficulty of attacking the city. The stone walls that looked like 5 meters, with the mountain base at the bottom with 3 to 5 meters in height, the stone walls were actually 8 to 10 meters or even higher. This town was quite stable. At least in terms of defense, it was not inferior to the Oasis lookout. Kant nodded in satisfaction and retreated from the god's view. The originally sparse mountain peak now had many new buildings. Many Rodic people were walking out happily. It seemed that they were also very satisfied with the new house. The newly joined refugees had finished bathing in the river and changed into clean clothes. They came to the street formed by houses together. The peasant arranged the rooms for them. At the same time, they gave a general introduction of the surrounding environment and the current situation. They were also assigned the following tasks, so that they could familiarize themselves with and join the town that had just appeared as soon as possible. When Kant returned to the council hall, James was still examining Bunduk's injuries. His face was somewhat relaxed. It was obvious that after the mage's magic experiments, Bunduk's injuries had completely recovered. Moreover, due to the effect of the positive energy, it stimulated his own recovery ability, allowing his wounds to recover very quickly. Looks like he's recovering well. Kant smiled. Bunduk nodded gratefully. It's all thanks to your concern, as well as James and the mage's treatment. It's mainly because of Lord Kant and the mages. James sighed. Magic is really a magical power. Originally, according to my prediction, it would take at least half a year to recover from the injury. Now, it seems that it would take about a month to recover, and 3 months to completely recover. This is really good, Kant nodded in satisfaction. I'm very grateful. Bunduk also nodded in gratitude. He had lost consciousness in the underground city of the Karst cave for a short while. At that time, he was already prepared to die in battle. After all, he had already seen through life and death during his travels in the continent of Karadia. Moreover, it was a symbol of honor for him to sacrifice himself for Kant. He did not expect that he would finally come back to life. Moreover, he would be able to recover in a short period of time. It was an unexpected surprise. Rest well. Kant comforted Bunduk. When you recover, you still have more work to deal with. Understood, Bunduk nodded firmly. You should rest well in the room and recuperate. Kant smiled and turned his head to James beside him. James, come out with me. I have some current government affairs to hand over to you to handle. Yes, Lord Kant. James followed Kant out of the room. I plan to return to Oasis Lookout. Kant pondered for a moment and reminded James, this town will be fully handed over to you to arrange. Understood, James nodded. I mean, fully handed over to you to take charge, Kant saw him nod, but still reminded him. Including recruiting troops, patrolling the territory, building towns, and developing agriculture and animal husbandry. Lord Kant, you're giving me all the authority. James sensed that something was wrong and was a little stunned. That's right, Kant nodded. This made James stunned. He immediately nodded and declined. Lord Kant, I can't be granted with so much authority. If Mr. Bunduk was still here, he might be able to share the burden with me. But right now, I'm the only one. I'm afraid that if I don't handle it well, some mistakes will affect the development of the town. There's no other way. Right now, only you can take on this burden. Kant frowned slightly. He was also helpless. He was lacking various generals, so he could only give full authority of the military and civilian mixed town to James, a senior doctor. It was indeed not a good idea. But other than James, Kant could not find any other generals to deploy here. Firentus needed to guard Trondheim Castle. Manad was an important person in Kant's communication with the outside world and trade with the Stone Pass. Even Rolf was the commander of patrolling at the Posthouse to prevent outsiders from getting close to the Oasis lookout. This hilltop town of Aran could only be entrusted to James. Fortunately, Bunduk's injuries healed very quickly, and he could slowly play his role in the subsequent work. Although he was still unable to take up an important position, it was not a problem for him to handle some light government affairs. At least they had all gone through tempering in the continent of Karadia. Just based on their knowledge and planning ability, they could not be compared to these ordinary peasant. Kant could rest assured even if they were handed over to him. After a deep conversation with James, the temporary development of the town could be considered to have been confirmed. James would be the main commander, and Bunduk would assist him, especially in the construction of the town. Kant handed over all the authority to James. Now, James was practically a lord that Kant had conferred upon. In terms of authority, he was higher and more powerful than ordinary village chiefs, town chiefs, or even mayors. He was equivalent to a lord without a title. This was a change in the system's rules after Aran had upgraded from a village to a town. It was originally not possible. In terms of construction, Kant could only choose and build it himself. However, after the upgrade, he could give full authority to James, who was equivalent to a high-level-up mayor. He was Kant's senior butler in Aran town, so of course, he could carry out the construction work. Kant made a plan for the town in advance. Then, James could build and perfect the town according to this plan. It was reasonable and perfect. In fact, there weren't many plans for the current Aran town. Only the main building was built on the peak of the mountain, and the slopes on both sides of the mountain and river were cultivated into terraces. The plan was very simple. The specific details needed to be made by James himself. Although he was a doctor, he had traveled in the continent of Karadia for so many years, and his knowledge was definitely quite rich. Let's stop here. Kant finished his own plan and said with a slight pause, now I need to return to the Oasis lookout as soon as possible. I'll leave this town to you. Looking at James, Kant said in a deep voice, the task is quite heavy now. I hope you can worry more. When Bunduk recovers, it will be easier. I will do my best, James replied solemnly. Okay, Kant nodded. Turning his head, he saw that the troops had already assembled. 103 Swadian knights in heavy chain armors were neatly lined up with their spears raised in one hand. The Swadian war horses were also wearing chain armors and linen robes. They were bored to death as they used its hoofs to dig at the ground under the feet. They were breathing heavily, and they looked like they wanted to gallop to their heart's content. In front, there was a knight leading Kant's warhorse. He walked over and quickly got on the horse. He said to James, you and Bunduk can worry about the rest. Yes, James nodded. Don't you want to stay longer? I plan to go to the Posthouse to patrol, including the current situation of the Oasis lookout. I need to go back and take a look. Kant gently knocked on the horse's belly and led the team away. The rumbling of horse hooves continued. The archers, footmen, and civilians all bowed to Kant. This was respect for the Lord. Even Bunduk, who was in the room, seemed to be deep in thought when he heard the dense sounds of horse hooves. He struggled to sit up and watched Kant and the knights leave. The road was smooth. The wide river by the side trickled with clear water. Occasionally, palm-sized fish from the subterranean river appeared in the river. They seemed to be swimming out of the tributaries of the stone wall. They were curiously looking out of the river to enjoy the sunny world, causing a few splashes on the surface of the water. However, there were more fish in the lake at the foot of the mountain. They were all from the subterranean river. Soon, they occupied the lake and happily crawled among the aquatic plants. If Kant still had a fishing ground that could be established here, the fishing industry would probably be even more efficient than the Oasis lookout. After all, the temperature in the desert was much higher, so it was not as suitable for the fish to breed here. They rode their horses and quickly arrived at the mountain pass. Behind a hill, a temporary tent was set up, and 5 desert bandits were riding their horses to welcome them. This was the outermost outpost of Aran town. "My lord." The desert bandits dismounted and bowed respectfully at the edge of the road. "There's no need to be so polite," Kant raised his hand. The 100 Swadian knights behind him were given order to stop. They quickly reined in their horses and slowly stopped the galloping sounds. Looking at the sparse vegetation on the hill and the many grains of sand on the surrounding hills, Kant understood in his heart that in front of these hills was the vast Naran desert, the true forbidden area of civilization, and the hell of the race. That desert was his nominal estate. Chapter 265, Trouble at the Posthouse. This was Kant's estate. It was nominally, but he was gradually taking control of it. Slowly walking forward, Kant came to the top of the hill. In front of him was a vast sea of sand. The continuous dune echoed with the hill under his feet in the distance, but the hot breath from the desert came with the breeze. The gentle breeze contained a cruel warning to civilization. No civilization could conquer this desert. Even the naturally tolerant Jack Allen, a stray dog that had been driven into the desert by humans, could not return to the relatively prosperous northern county. Even if they took advantage of the war between the Dukedom of Leo and the Silver Platter Kingdom, they could not make it. As a result, the large-scale migration and invasion of the northern county resulted in a massacre. The brutal massacre 10 years ago had spread from the north county of the Dukedom of Leo all the way to the Oasis lookout in the Naran Desert. Hundreds of low-level Jack Allen tribes had been wiped out, and the remaining ones had been killed to the point of fear. It could be seen from Kant's arrival. The low-level Jack Allen tribe had been completely scattered in the desert. If it was the same as before, there would be hundreds of Jack Allen tribes with close to tens of thousands of them. Even if Kant was appointed as Baron of the Oasis lookout and ruled the Naran Desert, he wouldn't dare to take up the post easily. After all, when the human wave tactic was exhausted, even if he had the advantage in quality, it wouldn't work. Moreover, when he first came to the Naran Desert, quality did not have an advantage either. What a sigh! Kant sighed lightly because it was different now. He already had some control of the Naran Desert, and had already established his own foundation here. Not only did he have a large number of elite soldiers that were among the best quality, but he also built a tall and sturdy military castle on the Oasis lookout, the only large-scale water source in the southern part of the Naran Desert. If the enemies wanted to destroy it, they would have to pay a cruel price. He pondered for a moment on the mountain top. Kant turned his head, and the 5 desert bandits behind him were still standing respectfully. On the stone path at the foot of the hill, the 103 top-notch Swadian knights were holding their spears in a formation ready to set off at any time and quietly waiting for Kant. Indeed, he would not wait here for too long. This mountain pass was very important. Kant also wanted to make some arrangements here. After muttering to himself for a while, Kant's thought communication system. A card that was originally floating in his mind immediately shattered. At the top of the hill beside him, void ripples spread out. A 2-story small building made of neat stone and wood immediately appeared on it. The foundation was firm, and the walls and wood were patched together solidly. Even the roof on the top floor had a vent that could be closed at any time. This building was a posthouse. The desert bandits behind them widened their eyes in shock. "This is for you." Kant turned his head and said to them, "You can stay in this inn in the future. It's much better than a temporary tent." After a pause, Kant warned them, "However, you must not relax in the task of guarding the mountain pass. You must remain vigilant." "Understood. Thank you for your kindness, my lord." The desert bandits immediately bowed respectfully. Compared to a temporary tent made of linen, it was obviously more comfortable to use a posthouse as a sleeping place. Similar to Kant's posthouse at the top of the underground lake, the top of this posthouse also had a watchtower that was more than 5 meters tall. It allowed people to climb up and observe the situation around them. Facing the open sea of sand on the outside, the view was better. An abnormal target could be seen from more than 1,000 meters away. It could be considered as the most important building of these desert bandits when they were stationed at this mountain pass. It was a combination of guarding, monitoring, scouting, or providing support. If Kant had enough troops in the future, he could also form a transportation network between this posthouse and the central posthouse, which was not inferior to the convenient waterway. "Let's do it this way." Kant walked into the posthouse to check. The house was fully furnished, and there were many grains and cured meat piled in the storeroom. It seemed that it would definitely be able to accommodate about 20 people. As for more, it would need to be the same as the central posthouse. The troops would need to set up tents around the posthouse. Otherwise, it would be impossible for too many people to live in this 2-story wooden building. However, this mountain pass posthouse did not need too many people to guard it. The most important function of this mountain pass posthouse was to serve as the outpost of Aran town. Naturally, there would be supplies from the town during normal times. As for drinking water, it was even simpler. Kant walked down the hill and arrived at the desert area outside the hill. The stone path that was originally paved with stone and slate was at the mountain pass beside the hill. Even the river path that Kant built was the same. The river path that was about 5 meters wide was cut off at the inner side of the mountain pass. It was parallel to the stone path. The flowing river water overflowed, forming a natural stream that flowed into the sand layer outside the mountain pass. A few days ago, the original river had already used an indirect source of water to wash away the edge of the desert, forming a 7 to 8 meters long and 8 meters wide pit that was half a meter deep. The shimmering water had turned into a small lake. The erosion of the river had even brought along the soil that originated from the Sinway range. In just a few days, heat-resistant shrubs appeared outside the water source. As long as there was water, the vegetation in the desert would grow quickly. Looking at the emerald green field, it wouldn't take more than a few months for another small oasis to form at the mouth of the mountain. It could be considered a man-made small oasis. Kant saw the greenery, and he liked it more. He turned his head and told the 5 desert bandits who were stationed here, "If you have nothing to do on a normal day, go to the mountains and dig some soil to cover the surroundings of the puddle. This will also allow these plants to grow more luxuriantly." "Understood," the desert bandits nodded. This was not a big deal in the first place. Moreover, it was Kant's order, so they naturally had to do it diligently. "Let's go." When Kant saw that there was nothing to do here, he got back on his horse. The 103 Swadian knights behind him immediately surrounded him. Kant lightly knocked on the horse's belly and shook the reins with all his strength. He took the lead and galloped ahead. The originally hard stone pavement beneath his feet immediately turned into a relatively soft layer of sand. The rumbling sound of the war horses galloping disappeared. However, there was the dull sound of horse hooves heavily trampling on the sand layer. This included the dust that rose up behind the horse. For a moment, it was not clear. It was as if hundreds of heavy cavalry troops were galloping in the desert. The imposing manner was powerful and majestic, making people tremble in fear. Facing the galloping of the cavalry, no army could maintain a balanced mentality. But currently, no one could see it. The path Kant chose was to move behind the hidden dune. This was to avoid coming into contact with the spy trade caravan that appeared at the stone pass. Although it was a long detour, it could prevent people from coming into contact with the town in the Sinway range. This was Kant's trump card and secret. If it was known so easily, then the situation would not be optimistic. Of course, the trade caravan usually headed north towards the Oasis lookout. No one would have thought that Kant had established another town in the deep mountains of the Sinway range in the southwest. Moreover, it could produce a large number of urgently needed resources in the Naran Desert. If it was developed successfully, there might not be a need to trade with Stone Pass and the Dukedom of Leo. This was Kant's way of getting rid of the noble families in the Dukedom of Leo. It was a means of blockade and restriction of resources. It would definitely make the noble families who thought they could control Kant's lifeline gnash their teeth in anger. In the traditional impression, the Naran Desert was a desolate and uninhabited forbidden area of civilization. That was indeed the case. However, it was different after Kant arrived. After discovering the salt mine, it was even more different. The profits of salt could make the noble suffer terrible losses. They would send mercenaries and slaves to mine table salt, and after they were transported out, they would turn into the best table salt and sell it to the countries of the entire continent. Although the price was high, it was indeed worth the price. The salt bought from the distant dwarf was also expensive, but there were still countless merchants who endured the long journey and the dangerous bandits along the way to transport the shimmering table salt. It was all because of the expensive salt and the shiny silver coins, which attracted the greed. Now, in the depths of the desert, a salt mine had been discovered. So what if they lost some slaves and mercenaries? To those noble families, what they lacked the least was people. What they lacked the most was people who were willing to sacrifice their lives for the silver coins in their hands. And sitting high on the top, they were making a fortune by eating human blood buns. Of course, there was only one difference. In the hands of these noble families, there was no blood, only employment documents. Some were desperate desperados, or greedy mercenaries, merchants who wanted to take advantage of the situation and become the partners of these employment partnership. They would use their lives to pave a bloody path for the noble families, even if it meant sacrificing their own lives, because the attraction of silver coins was deadly. After half a day's journey, Kant arrived at the central posthouse at dusk. However, facing the light of the evening, Kant narrowed his eyes slightly because he found an unusual scene. Beside the posthouse, a large number of merchants and carriages were gathered, and they seemed to be a riot. And in the posthouse, 10 Swadian militiamen were standing at the top with crossbows. Outside the posthouse, 120 Sarandian horsemen were standing in formation. Rolf was standing at the front, and behind him were 220 desert bandits. They were holding spears and scimitars in agitation, their expressions ferocious. The voices of the people were boisterous. It seemed that a conflict was about to break out between the two sides. "Let's go and take a look." Kant frowned and led his troops to charge down the dune. A dull sound spread across the flat desert plains, startling the two troops that were still in a standoff in the distance. Compared to Rolf and the others' pleasant surprise, the group of merchants were much more flustered, especially the guards of the trade caravan who were holding weapons in their hands. They all revealed their anxieties and fearful gazes. This was because the newcomers were over 100 heavy cavalry soldiers. Chapter 266, The Panic of the Merchants. Kant led his team and rode closer. The horseshoes struck the sand with a dull sound. It was like the muffled thunder of winter. The group of people from the trade caravan kept retreating. Even the guards of the trade caravan, who were holding their weapons, subconsciously lowered their weapons. Facing over 100 heavy cavalry soldiers with horses and heavy armors, no one dared to provoke them. Not to mention that they were right in front of them. 120 Sarandian horsemen and 240 desert bandits were not to be trifled with. The heads of the merchants who had led the trouble were drenched in cold sweat. They looked at each other, wanting the others to go up and explain to Kant. However, there was more fear in their eyes and an uncontrollable panic on their faces. No one would have thought that the plan that could have been discussed and negotiated would suddenly change. As a lord, Kant, who had the identity of a baron, showed up. He also brought 103 heavy cavalry soldiers who were fully armored. He broke the balance between the two sides that still contend against each other. This caused the merchants who had ulterior motives to ally together not only become the weaker party, but also began to have the possibility of splitting up. The principle of self-preservation was quite common in the circle of merchants. But Kant did not care at all. He indeed had the advantage, so he could ignore these merchants who were covered in cold sweat and even gave them a flattering smile. Riding his horse in front, he came to Rolf's side and asked with a frown, "What's going on? This is my estate. You are my cavalry. Why are you confronting these merchants of unknown origin?" Before Kant could finish his words, cold sweat broke out on the heads of those merchants. Unknown origin. This word had already proved Kant's meaning. The hearts of all the merchants jumped. They knew that if they did not explain clearly today, they would probably have to stay here. Staying here was not a good idea. Perhaps it also meant that they would die here. They have been in collusion since yesterday. It seems that they have a problem with the decree you issued. Rolf glanced at the terrified merchants. A smile appeared on the corner of his mouth, but it was a ferocious smile. Then, I recalled all the cavalries and found that these merchants have also joined forces and want to have a showdown with me. Oh? Interesting, Kant chuckled and turned his head to look at the merchants. A showdown? What showdown? The merchants subconsciously took half a step back. Many of the merchants at the back, who were originally speculators, had their eyes wandering. It was obvious that they were not on the same page. In the face of the current situation, they realized that the danger factor had increased. They began to retreat continuously. They even urged their close companions to immediately run to the edge and surrender if Kant made any move. Then, they would just have to identify the person who organized the riot at the front. The merchants were not stupid. They had sharp brains. Otherwise, they would not have been able to muddle along like a fish in water in this feudal era where the business environment was harsh. They even had their own trade caravan. Even if they were actually acting as agents, there were nobles behind them and controlling them. However, that did not mean that they had no brains. Even the three merchants at the front who had instigated all the merchants to unite and confront Rolf had become estranged from each other. They didn't want to escape or resist. Instead, they wanted to push the other two out so that they could survive. It was enough for them to die. The reason for the showdown is, of course, that they want to enter the deeper part of the Naran desert. Rolf spoke with a calm tone, or rather, they want to defy your order and go deeper into the desert to search for something. After all, before this, I have always been on the defensive, forbidding anyone from entering the depths of the desert. Oh, interesting, really interesting, Kant nodded. There was not a hint of emotion on his face. But the cold sweat on the faces of the merchants grew more and more. Because they saw that right behind Kant, the Swadian knights, Sarandian horsemen and the desert bandits all drew their scimitars from their waists, raised their lance, and stared at them viciously, just like a fierce wolf discovering a fat lamb. Although there were many merchants, adding up to more than 500 people, it was completely useless. Most of them were ordinary merchants and servants. Only a small number of them were trade caravan guards. But even if they were trade caravan guards, to be honest, they only knew how to ride horses and simply fight with knives and axes. If they were to fight against the regular army, especially the elite heavy cavalry led by Kant, it would be as laughable as hitting a rock with an egg. That scene was too funny to imagine. When they had gathered earlier, they still had some confidence. Rolf and the 120 Sarandian horsemen were indeed part of the regular army. It was terrifying. The desert bandits were also unruly. They looked like bandits, but their equipment was slightly inferior. The source of the merchants' confidence was the noble behind them. They were sure that as long as they charged through this posthouse and gathered together, they could use the power of the noble behind everyone to pressure that young and immature Baron Kant, who probably did not understand what a political struggle was. Then they would successfully break through the posthouse. They went to the Oasis lookout and even found the specific location of the salt mine. But now they realized that they were wrong. The young and immature Baron Kant was just like an old noble who maintained his prestige and did not speak to them, but that imposing manner made their hearts tremble. This was the calmness that only a true noble had. After staying with the noble for a long time, they could understand more clearly the unmerciful hidden under this calmness. The difference was whether Kant's hands were willing to be stained with blood or not. Kant did not have any objection to having his hands stained with blood. Or rather, he did not care about it. He just raised his head and looked at these merchants calmly. He said indifferently, "Can anyone give me an explanation?" Instead, the response was the blank gazes of these merchants. Including the three instigators in front, they all had blank eyes, as if they were little white sheep who did not know anything. "Hee, it seems like you don't want to give an explanation." Kant chuckled. However, his smile immediately disappeared, and he said to Rolf in a deep voice, "Then let them know the consequences of daring to violate my laws in my estate." Whoosh! 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 The sound of swords being unsheathed could be heard continuously. The already nervous guards of the trade caravan all drew their weapons. However, the experienced merchants and guards of the trade caravan at the front looked even more embarrassed. This was because Kant had yet to say what the consequences would be. This group of rookies had stupidly pulled out their weapons. This was basically giving Kant something to use against them and make themselves look like they were against a noble. Ordinary people who loved peace would not aim their weapons at the noble. Even a down-and-out noble baron. In the court of the nobles of the dukedom of Leo, it was still in existence that commoners like them could not offend a noble. Because this was the dignity of the noble class. Kant saw the uncertain faces of the trade caravan's guards, as well as the panic in their eyes. How could he not notice that the other party was extremely scared? There were also the rookies of the trade caravan's guards at the back. They were so nervous that they were covered in sweat. They could not even hold their short swords or scimitars firmly. It was estimated that once Kant's cavalries charged, this group of trade caravan's guards would be instantly killed until they broke down and fled. They did not pose any threat at all. Even so, the Sarandian horsemen still raised their spears at these merchants. The desert bandits all raised their scimitars, allowing the dusk light to reflect the awe-inspiring sword light. Even the Swadian knights stared at the group of guards and raised the lance in their hands. They were all prepared to charge forward. In a short distance of less than 10 meters, they could still launch the initial charge. When the sharp lance pierced through the enemies in the front row, the enemies in the back row would flee. In the end, they would completely annihilate the enemy's troops in the pursuit, allowing the desert bandits to pass through the enemy's fleeing troops, using the scimitars to chop down the pitiful creatures that had lost their will to resist. The bandits were quite skilled at this. They were only waiting for Kant's order to charge. But the merchants felt that something was wrong. They panted heavily, looking at the cavalry's gazes at them in panic, becoming more and more malevolent. Just like those real bandits. "No, Baron Kant." Finally, the merchants in the front row waved their hands and shouted in fear, "This is a misunderstanding. This is a misunderstanding. We didn't want to riot, we didn't want to go to the depths of the desert. This is a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding. That's right. This is a misunderstanding. Baron Kant. Baron Kant. This is a misunderstanding. Spare us. Lord Kant. We didn't dare to go to the depths of the desert. It was the 3 people in the front who gathered us. We didn't want to cause trouble. We didn't want to show our cards. It was the 3 merchants at the front. That's right. They instigated us. You damned fellows, the 3 of us were obviously coerced by you and pushed to the front. Don't spout nonsense. Lord Kant can prove our innocence here. How could the 3 of us dare to touch Baron Kant's authority? It was you who coerced us. That's right, you coerced us. The merchants shouted in panic. Everyone was scrambling to point at others, saying that they were the bad guys with ulterior motives. The scene was chaotic. However, Kant's expression was calm. He only looked at them coldly. He turned to Rolf and said, "I'm very disappointed that you didn't manage to clean up these guys." "No, Lord Kant, you misunderstood." Rolf shrugged. "I want to wait for them to finish gathering before I kill them all." As he said that, he revealed a sinister smile. Killing them in one go can solve a lot of problems. It can also get rid of those merchants in the later stages so that they don't dare to come over. However, since Lord Kant has appeared, I've chosen to wait. Oh, Kant turned his head and looked at the cavalries who were already prepared to charge. He nodded and said, "That's right. It seems that I've really disturbed you this time." "No, Lord Kant. They are just a bunch of mobs." Rolf swept his gaze over the merchants who were quarreling and criticizing each other. He laughed sinisterly and said, "Just this group of happy people is not enough to become my enemies. Even the weakest trade caravan in Karadia can at least resist a little." Chapter 267, Lord Kant's Pressure. The trade caravan of the continent of Karadia were all top-class retired soldiers. They led trained caravan guards and sentinels to conduct business. Even a few bandits and marauder were no match for them. Only a large-scale bandit group could take down these trade caravans. That was why Rolf looked down on these merchants. There were more than 500 of them, but in reality, they were a mess. These merchants were still blaming each other for internal strife when the enemy approached, so he was full of contempt in his heart. But he would never hate them. Because as a professional scoundrel and a part-time outstanding bandit leader, Rolf's favorite thing was this group of cute little lambs that came to him ready to be slaughtered. "Lord Kant, do you want to deal with them next?" Rolf looked at Kant. "This," Kant muttered. He understood Rolf's meaning. He wanted to completely eliminate these merchants and plunder their goods. However, Kant saw that these merchants were already retreating. They didn't even want the carriage that carried their goods. He couldn't help but shake his head and said to Rolf, "I'll deal with it personally." "I'll follow your orders," Rolf shrugged and slightly urged his horse to take half a step back. Kant walked forward. The merchants were so scared that they begged for mercy. Even the 3 leaders at the front, who had nowhere to retreat, were sweating profusely. "Let's have a chat." Kant gently knocked on the horse's belly, indicating for his horse to stop moving forward. Looking at these merchants and the irritating noise in his ears, he couldn't help but frown and say, "Be quiet, gentlemen. The worst situation hasn't arrived yet. If you continue to argue, I don't think the final result will be too good." The scene quickly became quiet. All the merchants looked at Kant in panic. The guards of the trade caravan were infected by the panic in the surroundings. They all felt strangely guilty. They even put their weapons back into their sheaths, afraid that Kant would misunderstand them. "Very good." Kant looked at the merchants who had calmed down in front of him. He nodded in satisfaction. "I am very clear about why you came here, but I think you need to know my rules again. That is, I will only sell table salt in the salt mine to Baron Dillon at the Stone Pass. As for this posthouse here." Kant pointed to the posthouse next to him, which was guarded by 10 Swadian militiamen. He said calmly, "The south is a trade route that can be traveled freely. It is the place that I allow to communicate with the outside world." The merchants listened quietly. Kant pointed to the north, he said calmly, "But to the north of this posthouse, it is a forbidden area that I forbid anyone to enter. It is the law of my territory. As long as I still exist in the Naran desert and I still possess my barren title, this law will take effect. You cannot go against it. Yes. Yes, yes, yes. Baron Kant, we understand. That's right, your lordship Kant. We all know that it's a forbidden area. That's right, that's right. We understand that it's a forbidden area. The merchants immediately spoke, their eyes filled with relief. It seemed that Baron Kant's words meant that they were safe. After all, when they were in the dukedom of Leo, they had not only heard of Baron Kant's kindness. Of course, at that time, the reputation of kindness was mostly based on cowardice. But now, they had come to face Kant's benevolent personality with deep respect. If they were disrespectful, if Kant did not have a benevolent personality, they would probably be strewn with corpses by now. Respect often came from fear. Whether it was fear of the other party's financial resources or fear of power, they would all have the same fear towards him. That was why there was respect. It was just that Kant did not have the slightest interest in this kind of respect. Fake respect could not be compared to the respect from the hearts of the recruited civilians and soldiers. Only these people were the ones Kant truly chose to believe in, and not these merchants. Raising his hand, Kant touched his chin. You all seem to understand. Understood, understood. These merchants kept nodding. Kant chuckled. Then can you tell me who instigated this rebellion against me? The scene instantly fell silent. Rebellion? What rebellion? These merchants were stunned. They still did not understand why Kant said the word rebellion. It was not wrong to say that they had ulterior motives and were spies from the noble families. But how could they possibly rebel? Aren't you going to say it? Kant's smile disappeared, and he turned to look at Rolf. Isn't there someone who started a rebellion and wants to occupy my estate and obtain my wealth? That's right, Lord Kant, that's indeed the case, Rolf nodded in agreement. No. That's absolutely not the case. The merchants cried out in despair. How could this be a rebellion? We have absolutely no intention of overthrowing you. Absolutely not, Lord Kant. No. The commoners overthrowing the noble and starting a huge rebellion. This was a felony. And this was the one of the highest felonies. It was a felony that the noble could not tolerate the most. Even if the opposing noble was overthrown, the noble here happily held a celebration party and secretly praised the civilian uprising army that overthrew their opposing noble. However, they would still enlist all the troops, for the sake of their noble identity, for the sake of the noble's class, kill all the civilians, and at the same time receive the spoils of war from the enemy's noble. The authority of the noble class could not be moved. Even if the noble wanted to change it, or if those mysterious mages wanted to change it, they could not. Or rather, they could not allow it at all. As for Kant, he also did not allow it. These merchants dared to test his bottom line. That's right. These merchants had gathered because of the instigation. But in reality, they were all in sync. They wanted to test Kant or Rolf's bottom line. However, they did not expect Rolf to have no bottom line at all. Once they dared to act out of line, what they would face next was not a negotiation, but a bloody massacre by the desert bandits and Sarandian horsemen. As a noble, but became a bandit leader instead, did Rolf has a bottom line? What a joke! If Kant had not come, they would probably have been slaughtered in the evening. And even if Kant arrived, he wouldn't let them off either. And he wouldn't let go of the leader who had incited these merchants to test his bottom line. It's them. That's right. It's them. Soon, the three people in the lead were pushed out. At the same time, many of the guards in the trade caravan were also separated. These people had expressions of despair and hatred on their faces. It was obvious that these guards and merchants were the subordinates of those three people. Now that they were pushed out, how could they not feel hatred towards their companions? Chapter 268, The Frightened Quails. No. Baron Kant, this is all a misunderstanding. One of the merchants instantly jumped off his horse and quickly walked forward. However, this action aroused the vigilance of the Swadian knight who was protecting Kant. He raised his lance and pointed it at him. He fiercely reprimanded, "Stop! You lowly B*****. My lord Kant. It's like this." The merchant did not mind at all. He said in a low voice, "I am the trade caravan of Viscount Wayne, the lord of the North County. Perhaps there is some misunderstanding. We absolutely have no intention of starting a rebellion or overthrowing your rule." He looked at Kant, his tone carried a hint of pride. "It's like this. Viscount Wayne sent me to bring his personal letter, hoping to start a business cooperation with you. However, I haven't seen your people, so I want to personally go to your Oasis lookout to take a look." Viscount Wayne, Kant narrowed his eyes slightly. "Yes." The merchant wiped the cold sweat off his face and quickly took out the letter from his bosom. "This is it. It's a letter personally written by Viscount Wayne." Kant took it. On it were traditional noble decorations. From the looks of it, it was indeed the decorations of Viscount Wayne. He used high-grade beeswax to seal the letter. "Interesting, isn't it?" Kant chuckled. "Viscount Wayne, the lord of the North County territory, the strongest viscount, asked you to deliver the letter to me." Kant's face drooped. "Do you think I would believe it? You are the most humble merchant, but you lied in the name of Viscount Wayne, trying to cheat me and avoid the punishment." The merchant was stunned and wanted to say something. It's true. However, Kant said in a deep voice, "This swindler who dares to use the name of Viscount Wayne to start a rebellion must be sentenced to death immediately." In the end, Kant turned his head and said to the Swadian knight behind him, "Puff!" The lance that was originally raised diagonally was instantly put down. The Swadian warhorse beneath him continued to charge forward within a short half a meter, bringing along the lance in the knight's hand and easily piercing through the merchant's chest. He. The merchant's eyes widened as he wanted to say something, but his windpipe was blocked by the blood gushing out from his torn lungs. He could not say anything and fell to the ground. The merchants and the guards of the trade caravan behind him had their eyes wide open. A massacre was about to happen. The two merchants who had instigated the guards to attack the posthouse immediately rode their horses and galloped away. Their faces were filled with despair. They knew that the merchant who had just been stabbed to death was indeed Viscount Wayne's merchant. In the circle of merchants, everybody knew each other. But even so, Kant had given the order to kill him. Even if the two of them revealed the backer behind them, they would probably end up miserably too, because they knew that when Kant came here, he didn't have any intention of letting the three instigators live. It was indeed the truth. Kant waved his hand. "Kill them and bring back the corpses." "Understood." Rolf nodded and signaled to the desert bandits behind him. 20 desert bandits attacked. These bandits with excellent riding skills quickly caught up with the two merchants who were living in luxury. They threw the short javelins in their hands. The short javelins directly pierced through the two merchants' lungs and chests. The two corpses fell off their horses. The corpses were stuck and pulled their desert horses. The horses spun around and rushed back, throwing the corpses heavily on the ground. "All right, our problem is solved." Kant chuckled. Looking at the restless guards belonging to the three merchants, he said calmly, "I spare you guys. I know you must have been bewitched by these merchants. You won't die." "Thank you, Lord Kant." The desperate hope made the guards, who were already trembling and did not dare to move, burst into tears. "Then it's our turn." Kant smiled and looked at the other merchants. Although the three people in the lead were all killed, Kant didn't intend to let these guys off so easily. If they dared to charge into the posthouse, go deep into the desert, and not follow his rules, then there would be corresponding consequences. Kant said indifferently, "Do you think that you can leave so easily without paying any price?" "We are willing, willing to pay a ransom. These merchants did not have any intention of resisting. The massacre just now had already made them understand Kant's authority in this desert. Even Viscount Wayne's merchants were killed as he wished. Kant also did not show any mercy to the merchants from other noble families. This kind of terrifying killing decisiveness made these merchants feel that this Baron Kant was not as flattering as the nobles had always been. He had a very popular gentlemanly demeanor. Kant naturally knew what this gentlemanly demeanor of the noble families was. It was something that differentiated between ordinary people and noble identities. It was just a rule that a group of noble families were bored enough to make. As the lord of the Naran Desert and a baron, Kant did not need to follow the rules. Because the Naran Desert was his territory. Why would Kant follow the rules in his own territory? Now that Kant had grown stronger and his power was no longer what it was in the past, he did not need to completely follow the rules of the dukedom of Leo like he used to do. He could cross the line and even rewrite this part of the rules. This was the benefit of strength. Rolf. Kant turned his head and instructed, "You will solve the ransom issue." "No problem," Rolf grinned hideously. "I like this job." The merchants could not help but shiver. They looked at Rolf, and each of them was as honest as a quail. They were constrained by the brazen act of killing just now. The corpses of the three merchants were beside them. How could these merchants dare to refute Rolf? They agreed to whatever conditions were put forward. In the end, a total of more than 30 trade caravans signed a debt of 8,000 great silver coins. As for the goods they brought, which were disguised as goods they wanted to trade, they were confiscated and turned into Kant's spoils of war. They were all ordinary food and daily necessities, and very few iron products. How could the merchants who came to test the waters have the ability to support the enemy? However, according to their speculations, what the Oasis lookout lacked was food and weapons. Since weapons were not allowed to be sold, then food was definitely the most important thing. Even if they wanted to sell weapons, they were also prohibited from selling these iron products during the inspection of the stone pass. After all, after being forged, iron products could also become weapons. It was a material that was prohibited from crossing the border, or rather, it was prohibited to be transported to the Naran Desert. Baron Dylan's ambition was also very big. Kant's Oasis lookout and salt mine had probably long become his exclusive property. Chapter 269, Cards currently in possession. Sitting in the main seat of the Posthouse hall, Kant sipped the date palm powder that had been boiled with hot water. It was a little too sweet. However, this was a sufficient amount of sugar, which could be quickly converted into the energy that the human body needed to replenish its exhausted strength. It was very suitable for these travelers who had come here after a long journey through the desert. The militiamen also prepared porridge that was cooked to a pulp. They added minced fish and dates sugar in it. The food was not considered rich, but it was suitable for the human body's current needs. The accompanying Swadian knights had already dismounted. They sat on both sides of the long table. There was also a big bowl of porridge in front of them. They had added sugar cubes and minced fish so that they could relieve the fatigue on the road. There was nothing more satisfying than the sweet porridge with fish that was cooked to a pulp, easily digesting, and still warm. There was also a bath water, but it was prepared for Kant alone. A militia came over and reported the bath water that had already been prepared in the room. Kant nodded and praised, "It's very thoughtful of you to prepare it." However, as if he had thought of something, he turned his head and smiled. "I remember that I promised to transfer you away at that time." "Yes," the militiamen lowered their heads and suddenly felt a little awkward. "There's no need for that now." "Why?" Kant asked. "My lord, at that time, there were only 10 of us in this post house, and this place was very gloomy, so we applied for a transfer." The militia explained, "Now that there are more people, it's also lively. It doesn't matter if we're transferred or not." Kant understood and nodded. "I see." However, he still reminded them, "At that time, I did consider transferring you guys, but because things suddenly got busy, the situation at the central post house is also a little dangerous, so I can't transfer you guys away at the moment. I hope you guys can stay here and work hard here, and keep your vigilance. Understood, my lord. The militiamen puffed out their chests and raised their heads, looking very energetic. They were not afraid of the battlefield. They just hated that there was no mission that could keep them busy. They just waited in the post house all day long. Even when they patrolled, they could not monitor the surrounding environment even if they wanted to. This is because they were footmen, and their foot ranges were very limited. Those guys with ulterior motives, as long as they went around this desert plain and walked between the sand dune on both sides, they would be able to make the militiamen who were monitoring the surrounding terrain blind. After all, they were not desert bandits, who could ride desert horses and could pass through the sand dune and patrol freely. The desert bandits also had excellent talent in desert survival and reconnaissance. Now, these militiamen from the Kingdom of Swadia only needed to help make food and ensure that breakfast, lunch, and supper were ready. The tasks were neither light nor heavy, and the post house was still very lively. Therefore, they did not want to leave this post house and their current posts. Since that was the case, Kant did not force them. Currently, there were not many posts that could accommodate these 10 militiamen. Thinking of this, Kant's eyes flickered slightly, and a dialog box appeared on his retina. In the interface of the troop class, the 10 Swadian militia had indeed reached the standard of level up. Since that's the case, Kant turned his head, and the 10 militiamen were all busy in the room of the post house. The merchants outside were still flattering Rhodic people and did not care about the situation in the room. With a thought, he ordered the system in a deep voice, "Level up 10 militiamen to Swadian footmen." Ding, level up completed. The system gave a notification. A crisp sound rang out, and a small amount of dinars was spent. And in the room, the 10 Swadian militiamen had removed their iron scale armors. Instead, within their linen coats, a precise mail armor appeared. Their weapons had also become fan-shaped shields and spada. Although they had lost their hunting crossbow and spear, their combat strength had improved significantly. This included their physical fitness. There were still 10 of them, but it was no problem for them to defend the post house. As for the troop class interface, there were more than 50 desert bandits could already level up to elite desert bandits. However, Kant did not choose to level up them. After all, from the current situation, the combat strength of these desert bandits was sufficient. If they spread out, they would be like scouting lone wolves. If they gathered together and cooperated with the Sarandian horsemen, they would be like a pack of ferocious wolves bearing their fangs. Not to mention the guards of the trade caravan, even the regular army would have a headache if they encountered them. The bandits that were nurtured by the Sarandian desert, and they could travel in the Naran desert like fishes in water. In the post-house hall, the Swadian knights had already finished eating. The light footmen were still busy in the kitchen, cooking more food. After all, the desert bandits and Sarandian horsemen who were still patrolling outside had not had the time to eat. In fact, the dinner that Kant and the horsemen ate should have been theirs. But they did not mind it. The cooking in the kitchen was also very fast. The new porridge, freshly baked bread, and dried meat were all ready. Batches of Sarandian horsemen and desert bandits came in to eat in turn. Outside, Rolf was still bargaining with the merchants in a carefree manner. It was unknown what he wanted to extort for Kant, but looking at the pitiful looks of the merchants outside, one could tell that they were probably in Rolf's hands and would have to shed a layer of skin before they could leave. Who asked them to be in a weak position and still want to contend with Kant? Even if Kant was generous and merciful, Rolf had no intention of letting them go. Great silver coins needed to be paid. All the goods brought with them needed to be confiscated. Even the next qualification to trade also required negotiation and bribery. As a scoundrel noble, Rolf was very qualified for this. Not to mention extortion at the max level, even threats, verbal threats, and physical threats were top-notch. Kant did not pay too much attention to it. He was also very relieved to hand it over to Rolf. Different people had their own specialties. Thinking of this, Kant began to miss the mages who had previously stayed in Aran town. If they were here, perhaps their deterrence would be even greater. However, this was just a thought. The situation below the Sinway range was even more complicated. The mages had long come to the conclusion that there were probably a large number of demons from hell or the abyss that were sealed underground, which was why there was negative energy that appeared from underground, in contrast to the positive energy sprinkled down from the sky. The Sinway range was a very cool and special environment despite being at the edge of the desert. And this environment was not bad in Kant's opinion. At least the large amount of vegetation growing in the mountain range was very good. It could be said that it was lush and lively, feeding more wild animals. Of course, there were also many demonized creatures, as well as the dangerous demons underground. Letting the mages stay in the Sinway range was also a guarantee for Aran town. Wait. Kant was slightly stunned. He slowly walked in the desert near the posthouse, and his footsteps also stopped slightly. He thought of the reward he had obtained from the mission to eliminate the abyssal demon. Moreover, he obtained quite a lot of rewards from heading to the ancient passage. He actually forgot about it for a moment. Dialog box instantly popped up on the retina of his mind communication system. Posthouse X1. Water Bandits Lair X1. Ammunition replenishment X2 times. Random Village X1 times. Recruitment doubled X1 times. Terrain Transformation, River, X1 times. These were the system cards Kant currently possessed. As long as Kant wanted to, then he could build or use it at any time. However, after planning for the future, Kant was somewhat conflicted. Although these 6 cards were extremely valuable, the cost-benefit ratio was not too high for Kant at the moment. Naturally, the river needed to be stored and could not be used. The ammunition replenishment skill also needed to be used at the crucial moment of the battle. These 2 cards needed to be temporarily sealed. However, Kant had already had an idea for the posthouse, which was to be built at the salt mine and specially arrange for a small team of desert bandits and a small number of peasants to be stationed there. Not only would they be able to collect coarse salt at any time and allow the camel caravan to transport it quickly, but they could also act as the eyes and ears of Trondheim Castle in the north. If anything unusual happened, they would be able to report it at any time. It could be considered as killing 2 birds with 1 stone. As long as they provided good food and water, the posthouse built at the salt mine could even become the center of the salt mining industry. When the salt-making workshop in Trondheim Castle expanded, its role would be even more apparent. As for doubling the recruitment, Kant planned to use it in the apprentice dormitory. This was the recruitment place for his only troop class with extraordinary strength. In the ancient passage and underground cave, he had already seen how powerful the magic power produced by a mage apprentice after they had leveled up to a mage. It could be considered as more than enough to form a single army. The terrifying single-target thunder, the group damage ice attack, and the summoning of golems, the AoE acceleration and sharp golden blades enhancement. In addition, there were continuous magic bullets and fireballs like a rain of arrows. Their combat power was abnormally high. They were worthy of the title of battle mages of the Unfoth Empire. However, the weekly recruitment of apprentices was limited to 1 person. With the doubling of recruitment, they could become 2 people. Although the number was still very small, the power of the troop class was extremely high. 2 mages could summon 60 golems. 10 mages could summon 300 golems. If there were 50 people, then they could directly summon 1,500 golems. In addition to all kinds of single-target groups and continuous amplification spells, it was not just a matter of one-man army, but reality. It could completely crush the psychological defense line of the enemy. It was an extremely shocking reality. For example, in a normal battle, 50 mages suddenly summoned 1,500 golems that were not afraid of death and did not have any vital points among the enemy. They held heavy hammers in their hands and started killing. The effect they produced was even more terrifying than the charge of 1,500 heavy cavalries. After all, no one could imagine why these golems would appear right beside them. But the random villages and the water bandits' lair. Kant was having a headache. At the moment, Kant did not know where else he could set up a village. He already had the Oasis lookouts Trondheim Castle and the Seenway Ranges Arran town. If he wanted to set up another village, he needed to be even more cautious, extra cautious. Chapter 270, Careful Planning for the Future, Second Update. Although the random villages would allow Kant to have an additional village again, it did not make sense in the current situation. After all, Kant needed to rest and digest the fruits of the recent rapid development. The analysis would lead to a conclusion. The environment of the Naran Desert was harsh. The southern region was not enough to support the two developed villages. The environment in the Seenway Range was also complicated. According to Kant's analysis, it was even more impossible to provide for the development of the two villages. After all, the current Arran town still relied on the Trondheim Castle to provide supplies, especially when the population had exploded to 500 people, the garrison was 500 people, and the size of the town was close to 1,000 people. Even if there were abundant prey resources in the Seenway Range, it was still too difficult to be self-sufficient in a short period of time. Therefore, Kant believed that the current situation needed to move forward steadily. The steps that could not be taken were too big, especially when it came to the building of forces and the development of villages. After all, what he needed was win-win cooperation. For example, Trondheim Castle and Arran town. In the early stage, Trondheim would fully supply the development of Arran. When the town was completed, it could produce all kinds of crops and handicrafts independently. Trondheim would completely turn into a political and military center. Arran would be responsible for logistics and business communication. The Trondheim Castle needed to build a better and stronger city defense system. The Arran town needed to let farmers, herdsmen, and hunters quickly take shape and feed Trondheim in the desert as soon as possible. Now, if a new village was being built, it could mess up Kant's layout and affected the development of the both castle and the town. Therefore, he decided to temporarily seal this village as well. As for the lair of the water bandits, Kant couldn't help but twitch the corners of his eyes. Of course, he knew about these troop class water bandits, the bandits that were active in the kingdom of Swadia, the kingdom of Viagirs, and the intersection of the rivers of the kingdom of Nords. They could be considered as the most basic wild monsters. Their level was slightly higher than the bandit, but it wasn't much higher. In reality, these water bandits were a group of bandits formed by the Nords, the Swadian, and the Viagir people. They were once the secret agents of the Nords' invasion. At their most glorious times, they had assisted the main forces of the Nords and destroyed the continent of Karadia, the famous neutral city of Zendar. However, after the destruction, they were immediately betrayed by the Nords. They were forcibly disbanded by the Nords and eventually became the bandits on both sides of the river. They harassed the kingdoms on both sides of the river, and even its former employer, the kingdom of Nords, had suffered greatly from it. Furthermore, due to their inextricable ties with the Nords, these water bandits were able to connect with the sea bandits. Therefore, the fact that both sides were able to work together without any gaps added to the threat. The trade caravan and civilians traveling between the three countries had suffered enough. If they encountered a small group of water bandits, they might not necessarily lose. However, if they encountered water bandits with the help of the sea bandits, it would be better for the civilians to surrender, as the sea bandits' combat strength was comparable to Nord's level 3 footmen, to the civilians. There wouldn't be any unnecessary casualties. Fortunately, the sea bandits usually wouldn't go deep into the mainland and would only move along the coast. Although there were many water bandits along the river, their combat strength wasn't strong. As long as the regular armies of the three countries swept a few rounds from time to time, the river would be safe and sound for a period of time. There would only be minor casualties. However, it was because of the frequent wars between the three kingdoms and the chaos in the entire continent of Karadia that these bandits ran amok. There was cause and effect, so it could be considered a helpless situation. Kant was also helpless now. The construction requirements for this lair of water bandits needed to be built on the banks of the river. There was no river in the entire Oasis lookout. As for the mountain pass of the Sinway range, there was one. However, just based on that small river and the unknown subterranean river, Kant had no intention of building it. Moreover, these water bandits also conflicted with Kant's current combat system. They were all footmen. They couldn't be compared to the desert bandits of the light cavalry, who were also bandits. In the Trondheim castle, these light footmen could only be cannon fodder, they were useless. Even in the Aran town, there were the infantrymen of the kingdom of Rodux, so there was no need for them. They did not have the stamina to cross mountains and ridges. They did not have the endurance and ferocity of the desert bandits. Perhaps they could only raid enemy villages on warships and kidnap civilians. However, Kant was not involved with the outside world. Even if he was located at the natural border between the Dukedom of Leo and the Silver Platter Kingdom. It was known as the most important supply river in the Dukedom of Leo. There was already a group of water bandits on the river, there was no room for this group of unfamiliar water bandits. If they went, both sides would start a fire because of their territory. Furthermore, Lionheart City was building a river patrol team. If they went to the river to develop the water bandits through the east and north counties, Kant would not do such a stupid thing. Perhaps if he developed step by step, Kant would only consider building a half-water army like the water bandits when they were needed. As for the current situation, it was still better to seal it up temporarily. After all, Kant did not have many cards that could be used. Only the construction-type posthouse needed to be placed in the salt mines, and the recruitment doubled was going to use for the apprentice dormitory. Other things, such as ammunition replenishment, random villages, changing the terrain, and the water bandits' lair, all needed to be temporarily sealed up. If Kant needed it in the future, he would decide to use it again. He would make the best use of everything, but it was not the time to use them yet. He was taking a stroll and thinking. The sound of hurried footsteps appeared behind him. Kant turned his head to look. It was the cheerful Rolf. Lord Kant. Rolf bared his yellow teeth and smiled brightly. Those merchants are really generous. Why? Kant asked. We received a ransom of 8,000 great silver coins and a bribe of 2,000 great silver coins. Well, it should be considered a rebate. I promised them the right to trade in the future. As long as they can come to the posthouse, they can purchase any materials we produce. Of course, they also have to bring materials that they trade with each other. Rolf revealed a sly smile. Of course. As for whether it's possible or not, it's still up to you, Lord Kant. Although Rolf was a general in charge of the posthouse, the actual authority was still in Kant's hands, including the right to trade. As long as Kant refused, Rolf would be able to directly take the blame. To him, taking kickbacks and bribes, while at the same time eating the other party until there was nothing left, he could be considered a qualified bandit. In fact, he did not care about any moral values. Kant also understood. However, the corners of his mouth curled up into a smile. He nodded and said, "Why not? I think it's quite good." Then do we really choose to trade? Rolf was stunned, and he lowered his head slightly. He was rough, but he was meticulous. Baron Dillon at the Stone Pass will be impacted by the benefits. I'm afraid that if we really choose to trade, the other party will take revenge. Especially for us, the Stone Pass is the only way to the Dukedom of Leo. Revenge? Then let them come, Kant smiled. It's not the only way. There are many small roads that can bypass the Stone Pass. After all, the Sinway range is very big. I'll listen to your orders. Rolf nodded. He did not know much about business. But he understood that as long as there were unfamiliar troops that dared to appear near the posthouse, he would lead the light and heavy cavalries to face the enemy. He would let them know why Lord Kant could stand tall in the desert and become the overlord. He was a staunch and full loyalist for Kant. In fact, everyone was. After dealing with the matters regarding the posthouse, the group of merchants gradually dispersed. Although they had been extorted of a considerable amount of great silver coins, but after sharing it, each person had only paid less than 300 great silver coins. Although it seemed to be a lot, to these merchants, it could not compare to the gains from the posthouse this time, the profits from establishing the trade route with Baron Kant. As long as they had the right to trade and the trade route, an endless supply of fine white salt would appear among the trade caravan, earning them bags of great silver coins. They were willing to pay a mere 300 great silver coins. Because the subsequent profits were enough to wipe out the current expenses, it could be considered as an initial investment. The posthouse returned to silence. The merchants had joyful expressions on their faces as they led the guards back. They all needed to report this information to the noble behind them in the shortest amount of time. As long as they received permission, they could start operating in sequence. They could use the table salt trade to earn large amounts of silver coins. As for Baron Dillon, who currently monopolized the table salt trade, who cares about him? He was just a puny warrior noble, a baron, and queen follower who was ostracized by the mainstream noble circle. Even if they knew that they had started the table salt trade, what could he do? Behind them stood a large number of nobles. As long as they joined forces, even the Grand Duke of Leo, Cameron, would have to express peace on this matter. A puny little baron, if he was not convinced and still wanted to cause trouble, then someone could easily crush him. It was very easy. There was no need to pay attention to him at all. Moreover, after crushing him, it would be convenient for all the nobles' trade caravan to enter and exit. After all, the Stone Pass could be considered an important land. It was just enough to connect to the Oasis lookout. As long as they could take it down, it would not be difficult to take down Baron Kant, the exiled young duke. The unknown salt mine in the desert would sooner or later become the private property of these great noble families. The people dispersed, and the posthouse was quiet. But the pressure Rolf would face next would be even greater. Kant instructed him, if you encounter danger, you can lead your troops to avoid it. You don't have to fight head-on. After all, the Sarandon desert bandits can also create opportunities to defeat the enemy through constant harassment, just like the Kujit people. I hope you'll notice this. Understood, Rolf nodded solemnly. Both sides had expected that when these merchants returned, the noble would extend their tentacles to the posthouse. Because Kant had allowed it. And when the tentacles spread over, all kinds of dangers would follow. Including the bandits who were greedy for the table salt trade, as well as the nobles who were unwilling and wanted to destroy the table salt trade of other noble families. They sent professional bandit groups that could rival regular armies. If they wanted something that they couldn't get, no one else could.